Now, if we think about some of how do they advocate, right, on behalf of their students, on behalf of their kids, there are, I would say, certain commonalities of argument that occurs, right? And now, of course, if we think about Sarah Roberts, that precedes the development of the 14th Amendment, the passage of the 14th Amendment. But henceforth, if we think about the argumentation, because also, right, parents needed to arm themselves with the right kinds of argumentative tools and skills, as well as their representatives, to argue on behalf of why do we need to have public schooling available for the public. Right? So we have the 14th Amendment, which secures, right, equal protection under the law. Of course, there are scholars, and even we have Supreme Court justices who would say this is really the true colorblind amendment. But that's not always the case, because historical work and the quote by James Anderson, but also the work that he's done, really configures how much it was a race-conscious amendment if we look at kind of the debates that went into that passage. So it was a way to secure equal protection under the law, but it was really in a way to heighten understandings of racial divisions. So it was also the arguments that parents used, not to say that it was about what I just mentioned, but really, how do we gain equal protection under the law? It's also the argument that we are tax-paying citizens, right? Even though in some cases, especially for Asian Americans along the West Coast, they don't have that legal right to citizenship. It's to say we're still residents, right? We pay our taxes, and our tax-paying monies should go to support the schools that our kids attend and have the right to attend the schools that are closest to where they live. So that's kind of the other arguments that they have. The other arguments, the commonality of argument, is that even though by law some of us are not allowed to be citizens, our kids, by all rights, are American-born, they are citizens, and then they have that right to be able to secure citizenship. And as mentioned here, especially for Asian immigrants, and I'll also go into that a little bit more later, but we have to also think about, in the history of the United States, Asian immigrants are barred from naturalized citizenship until 1952. And we have to think in terms of Asians have been in the United States since the 1770s, all right? And think about that, right, in terms of the history of the United States to what has then been able to be afforded to them in a legal sense in the mid-20th century. The other point of argument is that there is a right to education for all. And this was especially the case with African-American parents arguing on behalf of their kids in developing common schools in the South, in that this is, I think, the most important and critical way of thinking about schooling that we need to tie it to now, that the kinds of, or the best education that's available to all white children should be available to all children, right? Especially those who've been disenfranchised. And so if we think about schooling in that sense, let's ask ourselves, to what extent are we providing that best available education to all of our student populations? And when we think about some of the other early experiments during the Common School era in the United States, and there's so many great historical work that captures this, and I would name, some scholars like David Wallace Adams, Education for Extinction. There are American Indian scholars such as Fred Hoxie, Matthew Gilbert. There's also Shanina Lomoaima's work, they called it Prairie Light, that not only talks about the history of the federal boarding school system, but also talks about the kinds of advocation and the pan-Indian identity that develops as a fallout for that. But one of the experiments that come through in the mid-19th century, and what many historians have called this education for civilization, and white right? And how do we think about progress, again, and civilization in this light is through this highly militarized system of assimilating various groups of our indigenous populations into this form of what we consider to be acceptable citizens. But how ironic it is, right, that still this notion of citizenship is not fully extended, as well as the kinds of education and job opportunities in this way. And so these visuals are really providing you with ways that there was this whole process of, some would say, of whitening that occurs, that we realize, okay, we're going to provide this kinds of experimentation for you to become civilized, but at the same time, we realize that we're not going to fully provide you with that form of access to be fully acceptable. Right? So these are some, again, the kinds of contradictions that come through when we talk about education for democratic citizenship and education for second-class citizenship. And there are so many important, complex stories that come through in this way that I would really encourage you to really explore through those authors that I just mentioned. And I know you can do simple Google to find these things out yourself. And another example, and I know that there are other scholars in this series that really talk about the importance of the history and the development of African American education, but really the import and the influence of what did these schools look like and develop in the American South. And so here you have also a visual of an example of a Rosenwald School in the South, and they were called such because of those philanthropists from the North that came to develop and build schools in the South for African American schools and education and schools and communities and students. But at the same time, it hides the degree to which so much of the devotion, the sacrifice, even the funds were overwhelmingly contributed by African American parents and community members. So this is kind of an example where you can also do more historical research, and a couple of the sources are listed there for you. And there's wonderful archival materials that you can gain from the internet that really gives you an example and some of the personal stories by students who attended these segregated schools in the South to really think about, and again, I want to emphasize this, that 100-year gap in our public school system. 100 years. And as we move through to the 20th century as well, and again, I'm just giving you various snapshots of the types of court cases that came to light, why these particular fights for desegregation were very important, especially when we think about regions that we wouldn't necessarily think about. The Westminster versus Mendez ruling in the 1940s is a very important example as well. Happening in California, where how do we provide equal educational opportunity but access to our, and in this particular case, our Mexican-American school kids, right? Because by all means, right, we occupied parts of the Southwest California that was originally their land. It becomes annexed in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. There were elements of citizenship that was to be promised, but throughout the years, it becomes morphed and interpreted in different ways. But when we think about it in the context of schooling and the Mendez ruling and the judge's rule in that case, that is really, I thought, very poignant and spot on, obviously, right? But he states that the paramount requisite in the American system of public education is social equality. So in that, it's providing access just to be able to go to the kinds of schools that they should be able to go in the first place, right? That's really at the root of what so many of these court cases are about. Provide students and parents the right to attend the kind of schools that should be, right, available to them, to the public.